this is When They Come For Us We'll Be Gone, the epic struggle to save Soviet Jewry, and as the subtitle would suggest, it's the first real kind of narrative history of the Soviet Jewry movement, which was a struggle that took place from the early 60s until the end of the Cold War, of Jews in the Soviet Union trying to gain free immigration out, and the movement that they started, and the movement that they inspired also in the West among American Jews to push for their immigration.
This is my second novel. It's called Something Red. It's about a family just outside of Washington, D.C. in 1979. And it really tries to investigate the decline of radicalism in a family and how protest is defined differently for every generation. Hopefully by the end, everyone has sort of come to question what it really means to be a radical. My first book dealt with a family over several generations. It took place from like the 20s to the 60s. And when I started thinking about writing a second novel, which is always very daunting, the next novel, I realized we talk so much about what it means to be Jewish culturally in this country, and I really wanted to tackle what it meant to be politically Jewish. And it's interesting, I'm sure we'll talk about it with Gal's book, what that means is so different depending on the time period. So 1979 was a fascinating time just because you had the hangover from the 60s, you had the hangover really from the 20s and the 30s also, which were just these big protest movements, and Jews figured largely into them. And I wanted to sort of figure out how one family dealt with a decline in radicalism over time. So that's sort of why I chose the 70s, also because culturally it was such a fascinating time.
Like Jennifer, we were growing up kind of at the kind of tail end of the Cold War, and the notion of there being this Jewish boy who was living on the other side of the Iron Wall, who was suffering in all these kind of, not in the way that my grandparents had suffered, but in a way that was almost a little bit difficult for me to understand, really intrigued me. Or that there still should be Jews suffering at that point in history for being Jewish. It was almost like this, our culture was so saturated with the Holocaust stuff, and even though at some level it was completely, it was impossible to penetrate that experience, I kind of knew that, and I knew the grandparents that I saw growing up who had all been in concentration camps and were now these kind of normal functioning, wonderful, sweet grandparents. But there was this period after, where that became even more difficult to understand in a way. And I think that some of that curiosity was satisfied in looking at this movement because it kind of answered a lot of those questions.
For me, I'm very interested in families and what happens to families over time. And so this move, which happened, after the war and after Jews left the ghettos and the inner cities and they went to the suburbs, was part of this sort of process of quote-unquote becoming American. That Irving Howe sort of talked about, which Gil talks about in his book a little bit, and that would sort of strip us of the Jewish experience. And I was sort of interested in that because I really see it part of the Jewish American process, or part of that experience. And I just remember, partially because my father was an economist and he dealt with foreign food policy. So I was always hearing about the grain embargo and Carter and using food as a weapon and what that meant. And I always thought of these poor Soviet children, starving to death, not having anything but like their stale black bread. And so I didn't have that kind of fear that so many of my friends did have about the Soviet Union. It just seemed like this place that we were starving to death.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I remember feeling scared. I remember
I was scared of war, but I didn't associate it with people.
Yeah. But I also remember that kind of interesting moment in like the late 80s, where there started to be all these kind of, bringing the two people together.
Right.
And I remember like television shows would start like filming there.
Right.
There would be like special episodes that were taking place in Russia, and there was this sense of like, we need to learn about each other. And
as a fiction writer, I sort of write my way into situations and realize, the Rosenbergs are going to figure so prominently in here. I need to read up on them. And I read a biography of Ethel Rosenberg, and I realized, and I get these little facts, she's a singer. So that figures in a little bit as a plot point. Just little things that you don't always get from newspaper clippings or this kind of thing. I also realized I knew precious little about the real subtle differences between communism and socialism. I mean, I knew obviously what I was taught, but I wrote my way into realizing I needed to know so much more about the Cold War than we actually did learn in school. And the difference between me and Gail probably is writing a novel, you put it all in the novel and then promptly forget about it. I thought I was going to be so smart after finishing this book. And thinking about things to talk to you today, I was thinking, oh, I don't even remember, which is weird. You don't remember how you wrote what you wrote.
I'm not a historian, you know, so I had to really teach myself how to do history, and I didn't want to write an academic style history book. I think I probably could have written it in 3 years if I had chosen to do something that was a little bit more dry maybe in the telling, but I really wanted to kind of tell it through the stories of individuals. Have it be, I mean, long before I was writing nonfiction, I was writing fiction, and so my inclination is always towards the story. And so, but in a way that made the research harder because I had to really find people through whom I could tell the story. I mean, that was hard because especially when you start to kind of gather so much information, like you said, and you feel like everything becomes essential to you. And to the story, and stepping away from it, it's hard to step away from it and kind of figure out what exactly fits and what exactly helps you tell the story, you know. And so, you know, I know that the first thing we're going to hear is from all of these like hundreds of people who were, you know, really gave their lives to this movement, but they don't find themselves in the index and are like, what is this? You know, how can I not be here? You know, and they can't really understand that. You know, I want to tell a story that like you can hand this book to your grandkids or something, and they can read it and be engaged and not be bored to death. So.
And I'm just worried about my great Aunt Ruth. So.
And,
There's a lot of cursing.